A number of different methods of overhead recovery. In this industry, one of the very popular and common methods is MORS, M-O-R-S, which is multiple overhead recovery. There's also dual overhead recovery, there's single overhead recovery, but in talking to contractors, what we find is that a tremendous number are using the multiple overhead recovery method. Basically, the idea behind it is a lot of people think it is more accurate. It's a more accurate way to calculate your overhead costs than, say, single overhead recovery or some of the other methods. It lets you track your expenses or your costs back to your actual job costs. For example, if I'm comparing two jobs, and both jobs will generate revenue of $100,000, but job A is predominantly labor driven, meaning that we'll produce most of the $100,000 by selling the time of our employees. They're digging holes, they're laying pipe, they're mowing the lawn, whatever the case may be. Most of the expense is going, or most of the revenue will be generated by actually having employees produce the work. Whereas job B has a little bit of a labor component, let's call it $10,000, but $90,000 of that job is materials. So which job will cost us the most money? Or another way to say it, for which job should we recover the most overhead? So as an example, if within your company you have overhead of admin people, salespeople, and office rent, which of the two jobs requires the most overhead? Is it the job where you're performing $10,000 worth of labor and installing $90,000 worth of plants that you sent trucks and trailers down to pick up and bring to the job site? You never housed those plants. Does that job really consume the same amount of overhead and the same amount of your salespeople's time, the same amount of your office space, the same amount of your admin people, the same amount of your insurance as the job where you have $100,000 worth of labor being performed? That's the gist of multiple overhead recovery. It says that not every job should be thought of as an equal. Not every job consumes the same amount of overhead within your company. If you believe that employees carry a lot more overhead than plants, then it wouldn't make sense on two jobs that are each $100,000 to apply the same amount of overhead cost to each job when estimating and bidding that job. That again is the basic gist of multiple overhead recovery. It says apply overhead costs to a job, to an estimate, to a bid based on how much labor will be involved, based on how much equipment, based on how much plant material will be involved, and figure out your overhead based on the component parts of the job, not just on the dollar volume of the job. You'll see that a lot of companies will assign an overhead cost to labor versus to equipment versus to materials. And the overhead cost associated back to labor, equipment, or materials is typically a percentage. From my personal perspective, and I'm not an expert on any of this, but from my perspective, the flaw I see is that I think a lot of companies use multiple overhead recovery because it does make a tremendous amount of sense, as your labor, your people that work directly for you, do cost you more money than saying going down the street and picking up a product that's a non-inventory product. It didn't cost you that much money to house that product, touch that product, deal with that product, insure that product, because you weren't storing it at your facility, you weren't dealing with it. Therefore, there should be a lot less overhead associated to that product because it's a non-inventory product that you're not having to deal with. That makes a lot of sense to me. Whereas a employee who you have labor burden and all of these different costs, they do require a tremendous amount of overhead, admin overhead, sales and marketing. So it does make sense in a bigger percentage of overhead should be applied to that person. That's the basic gist of multiple overhead recovery, is you're saying that materials, when I sell a material for $100, I should not recover as much of overhead cost. Whereas when I sell time, I sell my employees, they take up so much of my overhead as a company, I should build into my cost structure a lot more overhead cost that I'm going to recover for each employee. So to give you an example, what I see often is a lot of companies, and this was the point I started to make that I feel like is a flaw, even though I'm not an expert on this, is what I see is a lot of companies will say we do multiple overhead recovery, and a standard is that labor recovers overhead at 25%. So if I sell time, I sell my labor for whatever that cost is, I take it against 0.25 or 25%, and that becomes the dollar amount that I apply in overhead cost to that job. Whereas if I have a subcontractor, a standard that we see is 5%. For assets and equipment, we see 15%. For product and materials, we see 10% as the overhead recovery amount. So basically it's saying when I incur labor, I try to recover overhead at a 25%, whereas I recover overhead at 5% for subcontractors. So this flaw I'm alluding to is that a lot of companies have read and done research and found that multiple overhead recovery might be their best method for figuring out overhead within their business, yet when they go to apply the overhead cost to their business, they just use standards. As I said, the 25% for labor, 5% for subs, 15% for equipment. But how does that in any way equate to what your real costs are as a business? I know, for example, in my business, my costs have changed completely from the days when it was just me and a few people in the very early days of the business to today, where we have a lot of people, a lot of trucks, a lot of fixed overhead. My cost structure is totally different today, and just using a simple formula of 25% for labor or 5% for subs does not work. And that's where consultants and accountants come into play to truly figure out what your percentages need to be for multiple overhead recovery. So I don't know if this is truly the most common practice for recovering overhead within the industry, but it's the one I hear about most. And my recommendation is, if you read about it and you choose to use it within your business, then don't just use the industry standards. Have a consultant, have your accountant figure out for you, if you're going to use multiple overhead recovery, what should that percentage be for labor versus subs versus assets and equipment versus products and materials for your business, not just what you read in a book or what you've heard the standard tends to be across the industry.